Welcome to Office Hours Live. This is actually a live representation of our Office Hours program, which happens every third Wednesday of the month. If you type into Google Kubernetes Office Hours, we have a session for Europeans. We have a session for the West Coast of the Americas. We have written down how we're doing this and streaming this. So if you're in an area, the idea is you should be able to execute your own office hours just by reading all the stuff. I have like a whole script that you can read. We have an intro, we have an outro. For those of you watching the video, would really, really love to bring this closer to the Indian time zone in that part of the world and the Far East, as an American, what I call the Far East. So if you're interested in doing that, we have the resources to help you. We can help you. We just need people to get together in those time zones in a to be able to let us execute. So what is office hours? Basically, I started Heptio. I didn't know Kubernetes. I was going to write everything down. I was going to edit a wiki, right? I did the Linux thing, and I was like, you know, it's the new era. I'm going to do a radio show on YouTube because that's what all the kids are doing. And I talked to Ilya, and he was like, we'd wanted to do this for a long time, and he comes from a user experience background. So he was like, it would be great if like there was a safe place where you can just ask questions, no judgment. No one's going to yell at you if you don't know what a pod is. Joe doesn't know what a pod is. Just kidding. Yeah, exactly. So what we really do, because we can't go in and like diagnose your cluster in SSHM, what we do is talk about the concepts and the basic understandings to give you a place to go. So using the pod example, when we had Joe on, we didn't just ask him to explain what a pod was, right? It was, back then, how did you come to the conclusion of a pod being the primitive, right? Why does every pod have an IP address? So when we talk about the concepts like that, I feel it helps people and users understand what's happening, and your understanding of Kubernetes exponentially grows. And mine has just, I don't even answer questions. I just sit there and moderate. So we have a lot of great companies that donate engineering time to allow their engineers to help users, and they do this every month. So I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel. By the way, we're always looking for volunteers. So if you're looking for a way to give back to the Kubernetes community, this is a great way to do it. You don't have to be a total expert because there's enough of you up here that like you can just George it, which is fake it till you make it. So Booyah, why don't you start first? Your name, your affiliation, and your area of work. I think you need to talk into it. There you go. Or you can have a net. This one's named a net at the Bunsky. There we go.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Ilya from Giant Swarm. I'm developer advocate. I mainly work in security auth and I do clusters on AWS, Azure, and on-prem.
Into the mic.
Just use this.
Okay.
Yep. Start over.
Sure, like this? Ah, nice. Yeah. Puya from Giant Swarm. I'm a developer advocate, mainly in security auth and do clusters AWS, Azure, and on-prem.
Hi, I am Bob Killen with the University of Michigan. I am a research cloud administrator, and sort of my specialty is all things on-prem, BGP, and all that fun stuff.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Van Slyke. I work at Microsoft on the Azure Containers team, and I work on upstream Kubernetes, mostly around service catalog, and I also like to make pony clusters in my free time.
I'm Ilya from Weaveworks. I work in DX team, developer experience, and focusing on developer experience. Well, when it comes down to app developers using Kubernetes, perhaps for the first time, or they're some of them used for the first time. Anyway, but like there's that developer experience stuff, app developer experience, and also know a fair bit about networking and things related to that.
I'm Solly Ross. I work at Red Hat on OpenShift and Kubernetes. I'm one of the SIG leads of SIG autoscaling, but I also know a decent bit about random other parts of Kubernetes.
Does this work? All right. Awesome. So anyone want to go first and ask a question? Ooh, all right.
I'm not sure if my question is for this session, but I'm looking to rewrite my couple of year-old deploy scripts for vSphere, and like to get some guidance on the current state. I have seen Cube deploy. I saw Cubicorn. What's the way to go?
I guess I'll start. Okay. Well, yeah, I guess it really sort of depends on your infrastructure, what you're trying to deploy to, what, like, can you give us a little bit more information? vSphere? Yeah, is it vSphere? Oh, okay. Have you looked into, like, VMware's integration stuff with, Cloud Foundry?
I've been to the VMware SIG.
Okay.
I've been to the VMware SIG and asked them the same question, more or less. And they say, well, there's a lot of work to do.
Okay.
Currently, I deploy, so I have the scripts, but they're old, and I just want to do something new with them.
Yeah, I've done a bit of work on cluster lifecycle stuff. So it really depends on the style you'd like to go about this. So, for example, one option, if you're interested, is it could be Linux Kit. You could actually bake images which include all the bits with Linux Kit and make them sort of. It's like, I don't know if you heard of Linux Kit, but it's basically like a toolkit for building your own container optimized operating systems, right? And you could also consider Google's container optimized OS as well. But if you want to use a more traditional OS, so with Linux Kit you could basically build VM images that you just deploy for a master node or whatever, and there's very little configuration. You just need to pass some metadata in. So that's one option. There's also a question of whether you want to use VMware storage or anything like that. If you're using a paid version of VMware or free version, obviously is also the question whether you have that added capability like storage or anything like that. And another thing, I know there's some support in COPS, but I think it's still early days. So if you prefer to go the route that would basically you would basically use some of the tools they used in the past, whatever you used in the scripts to install Linux for like that you mentioned, right? If you want to build up on that, then there's probably a way to do that. But like if you want to do something completely new.
Yeah. Currently, I use the CoreOS vSphere images and the cloud in it. And I prefer to work with the machine API because that looks like the way to go.
Oh, sure.
But I need some guidance on the state of the project and who to talk to. And
yeah. Does anybody here know much about machine API status?
Let's pass the mic around the audience. More audience participation, the better. So if you could answer a question,
yeah,
even better.
I know that one of the companies I used to work for, they're building their on-prem cluster in VMware, and they've gone with Terraform and Tectonic, and they use basically Pixie Boot and Terraform to configure Tectonic, and using CoreOS to build their clusters in that way, and that's certainly working very well for them.
Joe had a comment.
Sure, yeah, please.
You guys pass the mic that way.
So you mentioned, so which version of Kubernetes are you working with here?
currently, it's old. It's 1.6, but I want to go to.
Okay, so part of this is how do you migrate from 1.6 to something that's more up to date?
I think I can just build a new cluster and migrate.
Yeah, no, and that's a sane way to think about it.
Because it's such a big step. I don't think it's too hard to take all the steps in between.
Yeah. So one of the things in SIG cluster lifecycle that we've been trying to do is break this down to layers and share tooling across as many different environments as possible. There's a ton of projects out there. The one that I've been working with a lot and that we're continuing to invest in is kubeadm. Now, kubeadm we're going to be working. It's marked as beta, but it's pretty stable, and a lot of folks are using it. If you're just doing a single node control plane, it's really easy to get going right away. There are instructions for doing HA. It's a little bit more sort of, elbow grease, but you can get there. KubeADM assumes that you have machines. Once you have machines, it creates a cluster on top of those machines. So it separates that sort of provisioning layer from the actual bringing up the cluster part. If you're looking at provisioning, there's obviously a ton of tools that help you to provision stuff, whether it be something like Terraform targeted at VMware or what have you. Projects like Cubicorn, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in this class, use this other, still new and developing effort called the Cluster API, which is to create this layer where we use some of the same API patterns and reconciliation, not just for creating the cluster, but also allocating the infrastructure that the cluster runs on top of. And so as we start, getting more clarity around those layers, I think that we're going to see more mix and match of these different types of components and more flexibility and new features like cluster auto-scaling in a more generic way. So I don't think anybody using those things I haven't seen anything that's like, here's the instructions, boom, boom, boom. But if you're going to start looking at technologies and investing in understanding them, that's the stuff that I would start looking at.
Thanks.
Yeah, so the question is who to talk to. Yeah, SIG Cluster Lifecycle is the right group to talk to there. We're spread pretty thin doing a bunch of stuff. So one of the things that I think we would love to have as a community is a really comprehensive sort of operations guide that covers all these different scenarios. One of the difficulties, because it's a community project, it's difficult to pick winners. It's difficult to say this is the way to do it because there's so many options, and as a community, we want to give a fair shake to everybody in all these different ways of doing this stuff. So that does make it more difficult. So I empathize with you there.
Yeah, like additionally to SIG Cluster Lifecycle, there is now a work group on Cluster API, which is very new. This is what like Joe was talking about when talking about Kubicorn. So this going the API approach to spin a cluster. If you want to do it right now and you're on CoreOS, try Pixie booting VMware is very easy. We do that on-prem at some customers. And then try maybe Ignition. There is a tool by CoreOS or now Red Hat, which is called Matchbox. That is basically a Pixie boot server that you can just declaratively.
He is nodding profusely, so he must like it.
Yeah, and there's an alternative that we use, which is Mayu and Giant Swarm repository. But both are good. Both basically boot a CoreOS, and then you configure it with Ignition. And inside Ignition, you could use KubeADM. You could use your own systemd units, or yeah.
I currently use CoreOS with KubeADM, and it works just fine.
Feels like
Just wanted to clarify on my first comment regarding LinuxKit. LinuxKit is like an alternative to CoreOS, but it's more DIY. You're fully in control of what goes in the image, and it's built on KubeADM already as well. So take a look at it if you're curious. Yeah, it's like instead of using an upstream image from CoreOS, you would build it yourself. So you don't get the updates, but it's a different model, right? Just something I worked on. I thought I'd mention it. It's pretty cool though. Yeah, just to clarify, it also uses KubeADM. It's not something completely different.
Any comments before we move on to the next topic? All right.
So I have So hi, I'm Steffen from Flexbus, and we run our own clusters. And everyone knows that set up their own cluster. They know that it's a pretty complex topic, and I fear that this gets more and more complex. And of course, there's tools like kubeadmin that help with the complexity, but the complexity is still there, it's just hidden from you. And in the end, if something goes wrong, you still need to deep dive. And I think if you have set up a new cluster now, you need 5 or 4 CAs, and I don't know how many different things. And is there any effort to to reduce complexity, overall, or will it just grow and grow and grow?
So I mean, I think the important balance you want to strike is the balance between is the right amount of complexity, right? Because if you have too little complexity, if you go to too much effort to hide complexity, either you end up with something that is very constricting and doesn't meet people's use cases, or like will hit a real world use, works fine for a small cluster and then hits a real world use case in a big cluster or big organization that doesn't work, and having like way too much complexity where it's not needed. So like in the case of certificates, in the case of CAs, there's actually a really good reason for all those different CAs. Joe disagrees with me, but there's a good reason for a few of them. But I think, yeah, but no, I think there's places where we could simplify, and I think there's places where we could do a lot better at explaining like what it is that's actually going on and like the reasoning behind what we're doing, and less of just like generate these CAs and put them in this place, or set these options and you're good. Like explain, okay, this is why this is here.
I'm going to follow up on the same thing. Sure. Hi, I'm Carol Willing. I'm actually on Project Jupiter and Jupiter Hub, and we've been using in production Kubernetes for a little bit over a year. And it's great. We love it. It is also a really steep learning curve for even technical people who are developers making applications. I'm a core Python developer, and it was painful to set up instructions to kind of go break through the jargon, even with like the books that are out there, the podcasts, friends that I can ask questions of. And it's almost like, is there like a master visual of like the map of Kubernetes, or what resources? Because I'm going to work with university people, and how do I explain to high-end biology researchers or chemists or whatnot why they want to use Kubernetes and what the jargon means? Like they know a disk is a disk, but if it's named XYZ or this, that, the other, it's confusing.
On the point why, I think one good reason for that could be that all the new use cases, such as TensorFlow, for example, as we've seen Kubeflow demos, work very well with Kubernetes. So that is, yeah, right. So yeah, so exactly. So because I just can't see what it would take to take something like TensorFlow into machine learning applications into some kind of legacy infrastructure without Kubernetes.
Okay. So, well, I deal with researchers all the time. The biggest issues I've had with researchers has mostly just been trying to find good things to relate to the Kubernetes primitives. For the actual like sysadmins and things like that, once we get past a few of the big things, like a lot of times when they see a service, they think like a systemd, service, or your classic service, and not something that's like port or service discovery. So just sort of like going through those primitives, and like I have a couple slide decks and things like that like I've specifically targeted for like that sort of audience.
Maybe I misspoke a little, because part of it is understanding what Kubernetes is doing, but the other part that was hugely painful was getting to the point of Helminit on every single different cloud provider, because everybody has different jargon of how to set up, just to even get to the point where I can use Kubernetes was incredibly painful. And like, David Aronchuk saw our Zero to Jupiter Hub guide where we get people to the point where they can do Helminit. And he's like, can we steal all of this? I'm like, yeah. But, to try and push people through that is really hard. I mean, it'll be better, I hope, with the more like EKS and those sorts of things. But how it is now, it's complicated.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the whole kind of thing that we did with microservices for the last, I don't know how many years. We removed complexity from the software, but we moved it into the infrastructure stack, right? So someone needs to take care of that still. And I don't think we should bother too many people with actually taking care of Kubernetes. Kubernetes should become at some point a commodity either on the cloud or by some people that run it for you or have automation that can run it for you on-prem or in different environments. We're not there yet, definitely. We still need lots of work to make it easier. Like even if there is a team that knows Kubernetes in and out, those guys also need to have a life and sleep, right? They don't want to be woken up at 3 a.m. All right. So and the problem is that it's not done with Kubernetes. There's so much more. There's like, you need to take care of your networking plugins, your DNS that may change like in 2 months. There's other things that might change, the whole cloud native stack on top that will at some point help you deploy stuff easier, like Istio. Someone needs to manage that. And it shouldn't be the end user. It should be dedicated teams, and hopefully dedicated teams that you don't need to have in-house, I'd say.
I know, at least in our world, it's usually the end user that's spinning it up. They don't have the infrastructure people to handle it. That's definitely where, like, GKE and a lot of those services come in. And as other things like kubeadm mature and installing and managing stuff on-prem becomes an easier experience, I think that pain point will go down a bit.
So one thing is that I think that there's like different personas of like some people wear many hats, and unfortunately you are the dev and the cluster operator and the person dealing with DNS. And then yes, you're unfortunately going to be aware of like how the sausage of putting together a cluster is made. But if you imagine like back like early 2000s when you looked at like this is what it took to run a web server or an email server. And then actually people bothered to run their own email server until they realized that sucked, right? Like none of us for the most part deal with that anymore, and we focus on our higher level domain that we actually cared about shipping. I think that's going to happen with Kubernetes as well. So if you like wearing many hats, you're like, of course I want all the toggles, I'm gonna be my own cluster operator. But then you're gonna see more and more people who are like, I'm a researcher, I just wanna run my notebooks. They're going to either end up with, Caltech or something like that, giving them clusters that already have Jupyter Hub installed on it. Or I think Azure has stuff with like notebooks and things like that as well, where you can just jump on and start doing that. And otherwise it's, AKS, EKS, GKE, I think are going to become a bigger thing. But I think more people are going to start building platforms on top of Kubernetes as well. As the infrastructure matures, you're going to see this higher level abstraction where kind of like OpenShift, they're starting to ship more things out of the box with it. And it's going to push the concerns of the infrastructure farther down away from people who, if they don't want to deal with it, won't have to.
So I see this right now very much like installing Linux. All right, so you can grab the guide for Linux from scratch. You can grab the kernel sources. You can compile it with GCC. You can install all the infrastructure around the kernel that you need to run. You can install your GNU toolchain. You can install X from scratch. You can configure your graphics drivers. You could use something like Gentoo, which like makes you do most of that, but maybe helps you along the way a little bit. Or you could, you could grab the latest copy of Fedora Workstation or Linux Mint or what have you, right? And you could just kind of be up and going really quickly, right? And so I see like right now, where we're at, we have a lot of like Gentoo and Linux from scratch and not a lot of Fedora and Linux Mint. And we also have a lot of people that are like, I need to do Gentoo. I always need to install Gentoo, and like Gentoo is dear to my heart. But like, I think most people don't want Gentoo, right? Like most people want Fedora or Linux Mint. And I think we need to get better, at giving that to them in the form of like opinionated distributions of Kubernetes that are easy to set up. And I think we also need to I think as a community, people need to start realizing it's okay to run, Fedora and Linux Mint. That's fine. That doesn't make you less of a Kubernetes administrator. That just means you don't want to deal with configuring all the knobs yourself.
I just wanted to add, I think a cluster API will become very important in this area. For example, the cloud providers, right? Right now, GKE has its own CLI, other cloud providers have their own CLI. As you mentioned, they have all the different bells, and you have to make sure you get the right ones.
can I just disagree a little with you? I think at the moment we're still in that adoption phase that we need it to be commodity. And I think pulling from the DevOps background of getting people up to speed. In my last company, we basically ran workshops, like full day workshops of, right, you've got an app, it's running on an instance, here's what a pod is, here's what a daemon set is, here's what, not a daemon set because we skimmed over that, but here's what a deployment is, here's what a service is, here's what an ingress controller is, this is what you need to know. And then the rest of the day was like, here, let's get your application into a container and into a Helm chart, and then because you're on call, you need to know some of these things because you'll need kubectl to be able to kill a pod, just and deal with it. And I think there is still that ramp on at the moment that, yes, we're still in that zone where we do need to explain those concepts. And I think that will go away with time and with serverless, functions as service, all of that kind of stuff. But at the moment, I think we do need that with the training that's out there.
So time to serverless, 30 minutes. No, sorry. Yeah.
But I fully agree.
I think I just want to make it clear, though, that there's when you think about, I'm sorry, I used to be a PM. So when you think about personas, for example, if we're specifically talking about scientists at a university who are interested in actually just running their simulations, I really disagree that they need to be aware of what a pod is and init containers and anything like that at all. Yeah, but at the same time, if I'm a developer and I deploy to Kubernetes, you bet, yeah, you're expected to know what your stack is built on top of, but it's just different strokes, right, for different areas.
I mean, you and I agree on most things. Yeah. Here's the thing: at least in the scientific community, you've got a grant and you've got grad students, and you want to run Jupyter Hub to support your research team. I've got to deploy Kubernetes, deploying Kubernetes isn't the problem. It's getting to Kubernetes and then also sizing things. And that's being done by grad students. It's not necessarily being done by research computing. They're supporting from the standpoint of some knowledge, but if you don't have money to pay research computing, you're not getting it. And, and the thing with the grad students and this persona is they don't want let me just run a script and it being magic. They want to know, okay, is it going to crash in the middle of the night and how? Yeah.
So just to add my 5 cents is that, so just my.
It's good, you just have to talk.
Okay. So from our perspective, our developers, we had two options when we wanted to go cloud native. So either we give one of our developers basically access to an AWS account, or we give them access to the cluster, and the cluster is just 10 times easier than managing your own AWS account, which is almost being like your own data center operator, because you still need to configure subnets, VPCs. You need to know about all this stuff, and with Kubernetes you don't. So that worked was really, really great for us, and it's already a huge step.
Yeah, and I think we gained so much, we gave so much power into developers' hands with Docker and Kubernetes, with all these manifests and resources that, I would feel sad taking that away again, right? Yeah. With right, and I think we just need to do a better work with documentation, with better tutorials, the documentation. There is different goals, the ones upstream, the Kubernetes documentation about pods. It needs to tell you everything about pods, right? And then there's tutorials that show you a bit, but there's still some parts where we can do more, and we try, all of us try to write more blog posts, write more docs, write more stuff, and I see more and more docs contributions. I think it's awesome. It's it shouldn't be just lines of code. Lines of markdown should be twice the points.
I think there's probably just one quick remark. I think there's probably there are probably some very specific things that are concerning users adoption, like regarding adoption of Kubernetes outside the professional IT industry. I think there are some specific concerns that could be addressed by providing more documentation and, like, I don't know, dedicated subsections of Kubernetes website which speak in the language of the particular sector, whether that's academia or charity organizations or anything like that, like non-profit or whatever. Like, there are probably few classes like that, and I think that those areas have those industries have, like, sort of very specific needs.
So oh no.
No, I was going to say, thank you, because part of our problem with keeping up with the academic folks and the research folks is because you guys did a great job with Kubernetes. It's like, once you get to Kubernetes, they're like, this is amazing, we can do this ourselves. So I guess if I'm leaving you with anything, it's like, thank you for what you have done and will continue to do. And as vendors, take it back to your companies that creating, like, the managed, like, Kubernetes offerings, don't mess them up so that they're different in every circumstance.
So just with respect to that, don't mess them up, there are a bunch of efforts around conformance and things like Sonoboy to try and keep everybody honest so that we don't screw a good thing up. And I just want to agree with Carolyn a little bit here. This idea of creating experiences on top of Kubernetes that are actually more curated, I think that's going to be a critical thing. I think Kubernetes is a platform for building platforms, and whether it be a specialized platform for data scientists or whether it be sort of a platform as a service type of thing, the Kubernetes allows those things. I also think that those things don't have to be, they don't have to wrap Kubernetes. They can actually, it's not an either or thing. You can both use those higher level platforms and then drop down to the lower level when you need to. So to, like, extend the Linux analogy, like, maybe Kubernetes is the kernel, and people have to, learn how to, do they want to build it or use but then you might have, an X11 GUI window manager on top of that with different flavors, but, if you don't like that one, you can always drop down to the command line too. So that's, I think, the analogy there. So it doesn't hide that abstraction when people need it, but it does actually let people ignore it when they don't need it.
So just on the question, and Joe mentioned conformance, and I just wanted to let everybody know, I'm very pleased to let everybody know, we're going to be very aggressive on the conformance tests. If people don't know the strategy we use, they did this in a previous open source community. But what you do, if you ever want to do this, is you start with a small amount of tests, and you get all the vendors on board because they're all able to pass. You reel them all in, you hook them in. Because once you get them all in, it's like the old Roach motels. Roaches check in, they can't check out, okay? So we got everybody checked in with about 156 conformance tests. We've hired, through the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, we've got a couple testers from Google, a person who works for me who's testing, and 2 contractors as well. And we are in a very aggressive schedule to get these targets of 40% coverage and then 80% coverage. So look for very aggressive coverage as we ramp up the amount of conformance tests and improve that even more. But I just wanted people to understand why we're doing it. Oh, thank you. Yes, I'm Brad Topoy, and a member of the conformance work group.
Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, another question. Oh, wow. Let's get 2 more topics in. Yeah. We got let's get a new person. Sorry.
Well, it's all up to you. You got a 2-hour recess after this. You spend all time.
You okay to skip lunch?
Yeah, so definitely a switch of topic. If on spinning up a cluster, a lot of progress has been made with kubeadm in being able to just install a master and then spin up a bunch of nodes and add the nodes. It's super easy. My question is, like, what about for the rest of HA, where you're wanting to have, like, a fully redundant cluster? We're not thinking about Kubernetes as a service on EKS or whatever. How is that progressing? What's the roadmap? How soon can we expect to really, like, straightforward way to have a multi-mastered cluster? Does anyone want to touch that?
Literally our most asked question every single office hours.
So there are instructions right now using kubeadm. It's a little bit of, there's some hard work going on there. It's a hard problem, and the reason why it's a hard problem is we're trying to minimize the number of assumptions that takes on, right? If you make a bunch of assumptions like something like COPS, where you have an S3 bucket that you think is secure, that makes a lot of this stuff easier. When you're trying to make it be that experience of just run a command on each machine and boom, it's done, that's going to take a little bit longer. And so I think it's going to be a little bit more manual for now, but hopefully over time. PRs accepted? I mean, well. No, I think the focus right now, and I'd have to look at the schedule, but I think for the next release, we're going to be working really hard to get kubeadmin into GA, which means that for a single node master or control plane, making sure that's secure and that all the features that it's depending on, things like the TLS bootstrap, is in GA. And then I think starting to chip away at making the HA experience better is going to be starting now and then continuing. It's going to be an evolving story over the next couple of versions, but it's eye on the prize. We're going to get there.
Okay. So the kubeadm join -- master workflow was merged not too long ago, I think. Or there's a comment about it. Yeah. Huh?
There was some script. Fish did something.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, he's looking. Let's try to get one more in.
Yeah.
So hi, Stefan again from Flixbus. So I have a question about the release process, and one example here is I'm not sure. I think kubeproxy starting from 1.7 warned you, hey, command line flags are deprecated. Please use this config file. And then there was no documentation on the config file, so you read the source code. Okay, this is how it works. Get a config file there, and I think in 1.9 then the config file format changed. So and it was we had to go back to command line options, then upgrade to 1.9, and then we go back to the file again because it's deprecated. So I'm wondering, how what's the process there of in the future, or to handle this?
I can't answer that one.
Quick explanation of the deprecation process.
Yeah.
All right, so this is a long-standing Google Google tradition where the new thing's not ready and the old thing's deprecated, right? The goal with Kubernetes is to have a deprecation policy where once something says V1 on it, it's going to take like a year to get deprecated. The whole effort of moving things into config files is called component config, with the idea to make it easier to distribute these things and configure from within the cluster, so you're not in a situation where you have to reach under the cluster to start configuring stuff. I empathize with the lack of documentation on this stuff, and I think this really emphasizes that we do need a cluster operator guide that really helps folks understand, those types of options. I don't know what exactly happened in that particular case. Anybody else super familiar with that?
But is there like a structure of maintainers, or because on the Linux kernel you have this maintainer that says, okay, deploy and not conversions because it's going to break things.
Yeah, one of the things that we're trying to do is create more communication patterns, more ways for folks to make sure that they do all the things necessary beyond just writing the code, right? We've had, oh God, there was this example the other day. Somebody's like, hey, I want to be able to take a specific value, I don't know, and push it down. It was like a downward API. And so he's like, oh, we added that 2 versions ago. We just forgot to document it, right? And so we see more and more of that stuff. So it's this tension between how do we get features done and make progress versus how do we make those things accessible, usable, documented. Yeah, well, and documentation is not just more documentation, it's the right documentation in the right place that people can find it. It's a difficult thing, and I know the docs folks are working super hard on it, but there's a lot of ground to cover, and honestly, everybody has to chip in to cover that, and I don't think we have the right incentives as a project yet to really make sure that we solve problems like that in a holistic way.
And if you have it
if you haven't seen the docs recently, they actually just reorganized them to be more user journey focused. So it's not just it's not just a huge man page. It's like, this is what I know, this is what I do, and you can drill down there, and it's a lot nicer.
So we do actually, we have I think most of our deprecation policy written up. It is actually in the documentation. I can never remember exactly where it is, but I can usually find it, which means I think we need to move the link. But yeah, so like I think I believe we have a slightly different deprecation policy for APIs versus command line flags. The API one, I know off the top of my head, alpha can change release to release. Beta needs deprecation for a release and then can be removed. And anything that's in GA takes a long time. And then in terms of things like flags, we're supposed to wait, I think at least a release or two after we officially mark them as deprecated in the release notes. And that deprecation has to go into the release notes. And if it doesn't go into the release notes, it's not fully considered deprecated. And we try to follow this policy pretty aggressively. We do occasionally make mistakes. There's a lot of people running around marking things as deprecated and dropping notes in one place and then they get moved to another place. But we do try to follow that policy as much as possible.
Anyone have a quick one before we, I guess no, time. Thank you. If you like this format, it actually has a sister program run by Paris Pittman, which is called Meet Our Contributors, which is basically this, and Carolyn sits on both, where you could say, same format, different questions. How do I get my first patch in? I did a PR and a bot yelled at me, like all those kind of questions, how things are organized, what labels we use. So this is kind of focused on using Kubernetes. If you're interested in moving up to the next level, just know that we also have programs and mentorship programs in place. If you need a one-on-one with someone for an hour to figure something out, we have all sorts of stuff. And if you just type Kubernetes mentorship into Google, that will take you to the right place. So with that, I'd like to thank our panel.